Hi, this is Kyle again. In the last video, which was about installing Python, you would have heard me use the term development environment, referring to the idle editor that comes with your Python installation. In this video, we're going to talk more about development environments, which can mean text editors, but can also refer to integrated development environments, or IDEs. Nearly all programming languages have their code written in plain text, using symbols you create using your keyboard. There are exceptions to this, such as Scratch and a few other graphical programming languages, although if you look at Scratch under the hood, it's also just generating plain text code. Notepad, if you might be aware of it, is an extremely simplistic text editor that has existed with few changes since 1983 and bundled with every Windows installation as far back as 1985. There's a good chance for most people watching this video that every computer you've ever used has had Notepad installed. And Notepad, although it is very bare bones, is capable of writing code for hundreds of programming languages. Notepad, in a way, is very nice. Since it has so few features, it tends to run very quickly. However, it doesn't have a lot of features that programmers like, such as a tabbed interface for opening multiple files, automatic completion and formatting, context-based colors, and being able to easily run the code you're writing, among other things. So gradually, text editors better tailored toward coding were created. Some of these text editors are still text editors, and they can be useful for manipulating text documents. Their primary use is for handling text, and they happen to also be useful for working with code files. Some editors have taken things a few steps further and are designed to be much more geared toward coding. It would be confusing and inefficient to use them for handling arbitrary text files, so they are really meant to support programming. They get loaded with features that programmers like, and those are what are typically called integrated development environments, or IDEs. However, the distinction between text editors and IDEs isn't always very clear, so if you hear someone, like me perhaps, call Adam an IDE, then it would be sensible to just tolerate that. Although some of the professors teaching this course might recommend other IDEs, most COSC 1100 classes will probably be using Visual Studio Code. We will regularly call this VS Code. Different people do get comfortable with other IDEs, and frankly it doesn't matter too much, since the Python code generally behaves the same way regardless of the IDE. Code written in PyCharm should run fine in IDLE or VS Code, for example. Visual Studio Code is a Microsoft product, but it's free. It was developed as a lighter, simpler alternative to their mainline Visual Studio IDE, which programmers can expect to use later in this program. The mainline Visual Studio IDE is well known for being enormous. It has a massive install, it's slow, it's loaded with niche features, and it can be fickle and sometimes prone to crashes. Visual Studio Code does avoid most of these problems. The biggest issue here is probably the name, because Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code are very different products. Microsoft followed their classic naming convention formula here, where, for example, Windows went from 3.1
to 95 to 98 to 2000 and ME to XP to Vista to 7 to 8 and
to 10. And don't get me started on how Xbox has been named to date. Try not to get confused. For this course, Visual Studio Code is what we want. VS Code is recommended for intro to programming students, partly as my personal preference, but also because students tend to start using it later in the computer programming and analysis streams. We use other Microsoft products as well, and it's good for us to build the familiarity. VS Code doesn't natively support Python, but it's very easy to add that support in, and it works great. There are lots of other editors and IDEs available that are useful for Python, or for a variety of programming languages. We've already looked at IDLE, which is the built-in development environment, which doesn't have a ton of features, but can certainly still be useful. One popular recommendation, depending who you ask, is PyCharm, which is actually an IDE completely specific to Python. The specificity to Python is actually exactly why I don't recommend it for new programmers, although some of you might enjoy it. We used to also frequently recommend Atom, but we don't so much anymore. Part of the reason we used it was we learned it was commonly being used by our programs in our artificial intelligence-related graduate certificate programs. However, it doesn't come with a terminal by default, and thus it's just a bit more complicated to get started with for this course. Sublime Text, Vim, and Notepad++ are all very lightweight and extensible text editors that many programmers swear by. Of course, we can't list every reasonable option, and that's why we've sort of officially only suggested VS Code. If you decide you want to explore the world of IDEs, search YouTube for Python editors and you'll find dozens of folks justifying their opinions on the subject. In the next video, we'll be walking through the installation and setup of VS Code. Some professors might strongly advocate using another IDE. If this is the case in your class, go ahead and skip the video about VS Code. Of course, installing more than one IDE doesn't really have any downside. It's not like these are resource-heavy programs or anything. It might even help you make up your mind about your own preference. If your professor hasn't said anything about a preference, just install VS Code for now, and if you want to do another one later, you can. So in this video, we talked about what an IDE is and the distinction between text editors and IDEs. We also talked about a few recommended options for working with Python. In the next video, we'll be working through the installation for VS Code. By now, hopefully you could answer the question, what is an IDE, if you were asked that in a job interview or something like that. Thanks for watching.